All right, good morning. Why come to St. Martin? Why give a talk at Kaspersky SAS? Why have shots with the beautiful Tron women? Many, many reasons. You all have something that I don't have. You actually have the ability to affect the future of cybersecurity. A lot of people here are auditors, are penetration testers, and incident responders. And you have something that I used to do a long time ago. I used to be basically a penetration tester. And when you get in, when you find the malware, when you talk about how somebody could choose what they should do next, you have a powerful, powerful moment. What are you going to recommend to them? Are you going to recommend that they buy more security software? Are you going to recommend that they get religion with compliance frameworks? Are you going to recommend that they move to the cloud? That's what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm going to talk about that from the context for the last 20 years. I've had a lot of very, very lucky opportunities to do penetration testing, cloud architectures, to do intrusion detection. When I ran Tenable Network Security for 14 years, I got to talk to CISOs on a daily basis about all types of problems, from threat all the way down to compliance to how do they lower the cost of IT. Now I'm an evil venture capitalist, but basically what that means is I get pitched almost every day on new ideas in cybersecurity. So what I'm going to do today is share some of this stuff with you. We're going to talk about cybersecurity in really three different kind of aspects. It's very high level. Chances are you've heard some of this before, but not necessarily in this manner. Cybersecurity is really about three different things. Finding bad actors. That's the first thing. Second thing is about finding the good things, compliance. What are people doing right? And then the last aspect of cybersecurity is the future, moving to the cloud, resilient frameworks, things like that. We're going to talk a lot about that. And if we have more time, we're going to talk about some of these other high-level trends as far as the futures, where things are going. So, as I said, today's cyber is finding bad, finding good, and building the new good. Now, a lot of people out here, I was trying to look at your ages. I'm about my late 40s. I see a lot of people in the audience, mid-30s. So you might not remember how things got started, right? The security industry really was a result of antivirus. Antivirus and firewalls were the first security products that people bought and they put on their network. And any security product, even the top products that are out there, is only 99.99% good. And the threat was always able to kind of do compromises and affect change that we did not want to do. So the entire cybersecurity industry is one set of technology after the other that was built upon that. So the next thing that got added on top of antivirus in my mind was SIM. The idea of taking logs and events and bringing it all into one spot. And the SIMs became the priests of cybersecurity. This is where people would go to figure out and answer that question, are we secure? Are we in a better shape now than we were a while ago? And then the SIMs kind of took an interesting angle. They became much more of a compliancy story, not so much hunting the bad guy. And we had a lot of really big things happen in the last 10 years or so. And organizations deployed more and more security technology. The next big phase of innovation was sandboxes. Let's explode malware and documents before it got onto my network. And of course, that wasn't a perfect solution either. So then we did threat orchestration. Let's see if I could get from my sandbox some telemetry that perhaps came on the endpoint. Well, generating your own type of threat intelligence wasn't good enough. So now we have a threat intelligence industry. And we have a lot of organizations here represented from the best people in cybersecurity to do threat intelligence. But the reality is, even though these people are really awesome and their techniques are really awesome, as an industry, we're still falling short. CERT DHS put out a paper last year that basically said, if you take all of the threat feeds and you line them up next to each other, how many of that stuff is, in other words, if you buy a threat feed from one vendor, how much commonality is it with another vendor? The overlap was only 20%. This means if you have a threat feed where they're using passive DNS, or a worldwide network of honeynets, or honey clients, or I don't know, they're mining malware from VirusTotal. Whatever their technique is, it's probably really, really good. But when you stand back and you look at the total amount of cyber threat intelligence that's out there, this is mostly the IOC side, not actual terrorist and crime intelligence. The overlap was really, really minor. It was only about 20%. So if you're in the position of recommending threat intelligence to a customer or a client, what do you recommend? You tell them to buy more? Do you tell them to double down, to use it differently, buy a different type of threat intelligence? It's very, very interesting. Now, the other thing that's been going on now is a couple other big trends. The dominating factor in finding bad right now is the assumption that we don't know everything. So just let me collect everything that's out there. Basically, a lot of organizations are moving the way of becoming their own intelligence agency. They're doing full network telemetry capture, or they're doing metadata, or they're doing it on the endpoint, or they're doing it both, or they're deploying infrastructures in their organization to do east-west traffic capture. Because most of the time when you're doing network forensics, you're only getting inbound and outbound. And this is a big issue, because the networks that we know today are going through a huge, big change. I get the chance to speak with lots of CISOs, lots of SOC teams, lots of incident responders, and I always ask them, how is the migration to the cloud going? Are you monitoring your Salesforce? Are you monitoring your NetSuite? Are you monitoring Workday? Do you get full telemetry from Gmail? And today, 2017, those answers are all over the place. There are a lot of different answers for that. You can get the same kind of telemetry from those applications as you can from packets. A lot of people don't really understand that. And I want to make sure that if you're in a position of recommending to somebody that you need to monitor things, you got to get full situational awareness. So we'll talk more about that after. Now, the last thing I want to talk about on this cyber bad is that people are taking all that telemetry and they're saying, my data lake's pretty big. How can I make sense of that? I've already mixing threat intelligence with that, and it's kind of interesting, but I'd like to get better at it. Well, a lot of people are starting to apply machine learning and AI. And I think a lot of times when a vendor or even a researcher says machine learning or AI, they're really talking about data reduction. Let me look at all that data and produce some sort of nuance. Maybe I can reduce the number of events, find something interesting like a first-time seen event, or find something really interesting like a critical spike in data that's out there. So there's a lot of organizations that are moving that, and there's a lot of commercial vendors doing that as well. But there's not a lot of silver bullets. Just because you know that there was a spike in DNS transmissions doesn't necessarily mean it was a covert channel. It could mean the DNS server 1's down and DNS server 2 is up, and that's why there was a change in telemetry. So this hunt for finding cyber bad is definitely interesting. I think the last comment I want to make there is deception is kind of making a comeback. Now, if you look back at my slides, I actually worked on honeypots in the late 90s. It was kind of cool. This was before virtualization was really readily accessible and whatnot. And there's a lot of really interesting technologies out there. This can be a really, really powerful thing in the hunt for finding insiders, finding malware, finding documents that are exfiltrated. And this is sort of what I consider state of the art right now. But if we're talking about finding bad, there's this opposite process of finding good. And we've all seen this sort of simple equation, that risk is somehow the multiplication of some fictitious threat variable times some sort of fictitious vulnerability variable. Everybody understands this. If you have no vulnerabilities, all the threats in the world means you have no risk. At the same time, if you have lots of vulnerabilities, but you're the Smurfs and Gargamel's dead, right? There's no threat. Right? But in practice, this is really, really difficult. I would challenge anybody to walk into a boardroom, a vendor presentation, or just a report for your incident response. Say, hey, here's how I measure your risk. It is so subjective to measure threat and to measure risk. And because of this, it's holding back our industry. It's holding back the ability to actually say what I should do next. Let's say you're doing that incident response job for a major bank. What do you want to recommend? Well, how do you know what risk level that they're at? Most of the risk measurement that's out there is really, really archaic. So Tenable Network Security, we would basically go in and discover all the assets and find all the vulnerabilities. That's a cool thing. That's a neat thing you need to do. But is that a measure of risk? I don't know. You need to have the context. Is that vulnerability behind a firewall? Is there an antivirus agent? Is there whitelisting? Are there other things on it? Is that machine locked down? Is it a server? Is it an endpoint? Very, very difficult to do that. Also, what's the threat environment for those things? Very, very hard to actually see that kind of analysis and put that into an equation. At the same time, if I'm an auditor and I'm going to audit you against a policy that's prescriptive for an industry, such as PCI or HIPAA in the United States, or perhaps other types of policies internationally, just because I'm compliant with the policy doesn't necessarily mean I'm secure either. And this was the big struggle. If you were actually at a conference in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was a security conference, and you said, what does it mean to be secure? You know, you might hear a pen tester say, oh, I could hack into any PCI network. Well, that's a really relative type of thing. But what happened over the last 3 or 4 years is this emergence of frameworks. It started off, actually it started off all over the world. The DoD's been doing this. Most militaries and most international governments have been doing this for years. They have some sort of risk management approach. It usually gets eyes raised and sneers from penetration testers and incident responders because, you know, there's just all of these things, like the fact that OPM in the United States was supposedly compliant when these breaches occurred. But these frameworks are basically written by people like yourself. They're people who were incident responders, they were penetration testers, and they just kept tired of seeing the same issues broken into over again or the same failings broken in over and over again. So about 4 or 5 years ago, the SANS training organization in the US really came out with their SANS critical controls. It was 20 critical controls to allow people to basically say what they should do to be more secure. And again, that's a really relative term. But what they did that I really, really liked is they gave you all sorts of self-assessment and quick wins looks at these things. So if you weren't doing data backup, what's the problem? If you didn't have the ability to recover, you know, what's the problem? And it gives people like yourselves, if you're in that moment where you're in the catbird seat and you get to make recommendations, you actually have the ability to say something that's going to dramatically change where they're going. Now today, 2017, the NIST cybersecurity framework is getting a lot of traction in the US, and I'm seeing a lot of banking industry talk about it worldwide. Now, the NIST cybersecurity framework is this really, really comprehensive type of thing. It's hundreds of pages, it's really difficult to do. How can you possibly read that and recommend it? So I'm going to recommend a paper from the 2016 RSA conference by Sunil Yu. Sunil works at the Bank of America. And basically what he says is you can reduce the NIST cybersecurity framework into really 2 lists of 5 things. All the stuff that you want to protect and all the controls that you want to use to protect them. And what you can do is you can put that on a spreadsheet and you can actually put all your solutions and sort of mark out where you're strong and where you're weak. Now, this happens to be representative of you know, some commercial vendors, but you could have open source on here. You could have your own policies. You could have your own thing. The idea is when you see areas of white, that's an area where you have room for improvement. And that's an area where you can say, oh, look, I don't have the ability to recover in my applications on this thing. Oh, that's probably an area we can improve. But when you look at it from the point of view of raw malware, raw vulnerabilities, things like that, you lose this kind of context. Now, where I'm hoping that the industry is going to go in the next couple of years is to be able to do this automatically. We were starting to do this at Tenable. There's a lot of folks in this industry who are working on this now, the ability to roll into a network and do automated asset classification, defense classification, threat classification, and produce this stuff in more or less real time. Once that happens, in my opinion, we'll have actual true situational awareness. Right now, we really don't. Now, the last big trend in cybersecurity is that a lot of organizations are realizing that we are living in a bubble. This concept of having easily hackable devices, this concept of having easily hackable applications is getting harder and harder. And Mark kind of alluded to that earlier. It's getting harder and harder to do the exploits. They're still there. There's still 0 days. There's still things that get dropped with phishing that allow lateral movement and things like that, but it's getting harder and harder to do that. So a lot of organizations are saying, look, what can we do that's a repeatable, sustainable design pattern that sort of breaks the chains of how we've been doing scan, patch, remediate, or do an incident response and fix a problem after that. So there's a couple of big trends that are going on. The first one is this cloud migration. And cloud migration, I always used to tell the story, I'll tell it here. If you were ever an administrator, and when I worked at US Internetworking, which was the cloud thing, we hosted Exchange, we hosted PeopleSoft, we hosted all of these really complex applications for the late 90s, and we did a much better job than people could do on their own. We were better staffed, we had better facilities, better power, and we could also see attacks from many, many people. When you're running Exchange or any application for your organization, you're sort of sitting on one side of your firewall saying, okay, internet, attack me. You have no context for what's really going on nationwide. So, and if you think about something like the Exchange application, just to pull that thread a little bit longer, what is Exchange? You have a Microsoft operating system. You have an application on top of that. You probably have two of them for failover. Maybe you have something like a NetScaler in front of it for VPN, SSL decryption. Maybe you have a Barracuda firewall for spam and whatnot. Maybe you have some sort of storage area network attached to it. Next thing you know, that simple Exchange application is 20 boxes. I've seen larger organizations where it's 30, 40 boxes. So now the idea of saying, hey, I'm going to take that and I'm going to write a check to Microsoft and let them handle my email, all of a sudden looks really, really appealing. And when you look at the fact that people are doing this with HR applications such as Workday, when you're looking at things like Salesforce, taking your Oracle CRM applications on-prem and replacing it with a cloud thing, you are not only reducing complexity, you're trusting somebody in the cloud, but you are dramatically reducing your attack surface. This is a really, really big trend that's going on now. And for the incident responders that are out there, I have a talk I do where I say, what happens when all the applications you're defending leave and go to the cloud? What are you going to see when you plug in to the network and it's only just SSL traffic going to all these SaaS applications? Now, another big revolution that's going on with this migration to the cloud is the rewriting of proprietary web applications. Maybe you have a mobile internet application, maybe you have a web application. People are taking the traditional LAMP stacks, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, and they are rewriting them, or maybe .NET, whatever world you come from, and they are rewriting them with new architectures. They're rewriting them with microservices. They're rewriting them with containers. And if you think about, if you haven't done web application testing, you probably know that it takes a human to do it. This is one of the reasons web application scanners are not doing that well, and the bug bounty, the bug crowd types of approaches are really good, because it's such a hard problem to secure code. And people are finding bugs with web applications well after the source code people have audited all the source code, well after the WAFs and the RASP have done their thing. They're still finding these vulnerabilities. So what can we do? Well, we can simplify. Rather than having lots and lots of Java code or lots and lots of PHP or lots and lots of .NET, we're going to take these APIs and break them up into microservices running on small containers, probably under a Docker type of framework. Or we're also going to make use of a cloud API, perhaps Amazon's S3 buckets to store data, perhaps Lambda for some sort of Amazon APIs, that we can have access to. The idea is that these applications, not only are they going to be in somebody else's data center, they're going to be completely rewritten, and they're going to be a lot easier to maintain. And when you do that, you're also taking away some burden from your IT people. In a full microservice cloud environment, there's no patch window. You have something called SecDevOps, where if you want to roll a change, as long as the SecDevOps god are good with it, you just roll it. You don't have to stop and patch Oracle. You don't have to stop and apply a Microsoft KB that came out for the weekend. So this is really the two big trends that are going on in this migration to the cloud. You're trying to do good. Now imagine yourself. You're sitting in an organization. Maybe you just did a pen test. Maybe you've just completely compromised an admin through a phishing attack, through Exchange, through something like that. And what are you going to recommend? Better firewall rules? Maybe you're going to say, hey, look, you guys have a good shop here, but you really should think about moving online. Because if you talk to any of the folks who run the email applications at Google or Office 365, they see a lot of attacks and they stop a lot of attacks. And their advantage is that they can see these attacks from across the internet. It's very, very, very compelling type stuff. Now, I'm not going to get to go in a lot of other areas here and whatnot. But there has been a rebirth in what I consider things like encryption. If you think about, I'm going to go to the internet, I'm going to go to my SaaS applications, I'm going to VPN into my office, and I'm also going to go through like a Zscaler to get to my data center, I'm using like 3 or 4 different agents. I'm using all sorts of different VPN protocols or encryption protocols. It'd be nice to unify a lot of that. There's a lot of companies who are trying to take advantage of the cloud and mobility and actually offer those types of services as well. So kind of talking about that, saying what I just said in a little bit different way, right? We talked about a lot of people in cybersecurity today are involved in finding bad things, proving good things, or planning for the future. So another way to look at this is that if you get a chance to see it with a board, what are they thinking about? They are thinking that this bubble that we're in is going to go away eventually. They would prefer not to spend half of their IT budget on cybersecurity, right? They would just like to focus on their business. Most people I talk to at the board level really see cybersecurity as becoming some sort of data governance and policy problem. And the thing that really woke them up to this are the new European breach disclosure laws, where if you do business in Europe and you have PII data from European citizens, that's not your data. You're supposed to be a custodian of that. This goes to the very heart of cybersecurity, right? Nobody is at the boardroom asking, are we secure or not secure? They're asking, do we have any data from Germany and where is it, right? This is a much different problem and it requires a lot of rethinking. It actually accelerates what I was talking about moving to the cloud, trying to do things at more scale and more things. And then today, like I also mentioned, we don't have situational awareness today. There's anybody read Snow Crash? I'm sure you guys have all read Snow Crash. If you want to see me later for book recommendations, we'll talk about that. But there's this scene in Snow Crash where a woman's working for a government and she has to read an email from her boss. And she has to actually think about, well, if I read it too long, I'm not a good employee. But if I just click next, I haven't read the email. So I got to be somewhere in there. And that's much like this new Circle movie with Tom Hanks, where the more we monitor our employees, the more we monitor things, you also have this benefit of behavior. I don't know of any, or positive behavior reinforcement. I don't know of any organization that's really gone this far yet. I already mentioned how cloud applications are by default a bit better than applications you can run on-prem. And then the last thing I'm going to say is that security operations centers are the new SIEM. If you have some sort of forensics program, network security monitoring program, some sort of hunt program, some sort of incident response program, it all comes from the security operations center. And the security operations center in a modern IT organization, that's where the new SIEM is. That's where the new people are, that's where the new training is, that's where the new budgets are at, and that's where things are going. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. So, if you see me online, I'm not somebody who goes and says, here's what's going to come in 2018, right? I'm not one of these predictors at the end. But I did want to give you some thoughts on some of the factors of what's going to impact your jobs, the threat landscape, and what we can do about it over the next 10 years or so. So the first question I have is that we don't know how long legacy stuff is going to lay around. You all have horror stories about banks who have ATMs running Windows 95 and things like that, but there is no really, really good way of finding out not only how long the legacy stuff is going to lay around, but how long it's going to be until it's completely gone, or how bad it really, really is. When I would get to see vulnerability reports from the inside of a firewall at Tenable, I was stunned at what I saw. You know, Windows XP, SNMP version 1, just tons of different things like that. Even though the industry has moved on, we're going to be really hampered over the next couple years by figuring out how much legacy stuff is out there. Everybody talks about IoT. Nobody can quantify how bad it's going to be. We've already seen at least one big DDoS, but we really, really don't know how bad that's going to be. Most of the modern IoT products that are out there have some sort of self-updating, and they're almost like your phone. They're not that bad. But when there is a problem, it's a problem at scale. Nobody has really modeled that and put that down. We also don't know if there's going to be some sort of event in the future. It could be a political event. It could be a natural disaster like a solar flare. It could be something. Imagine if Amazon went down. And Amazon did have some issues a couple weeks ago, right? Is there going to be some event that causes people to want to stay on their own data centers and do it them well? We had a couple talks. We had one talk already that talks about, can you whitelist malware, right? So my fourth point, are governments, if things are going to get so better, are governments from all over the world going to, on purpose, inject vulnerabilities or inject weaknesses or inject monitoring built into the applications? We don't know that. And if we did know that, how would we model it? And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is that right now, I think if I was going to guess the median age in here, I'd probably say mid-30s, younger 30s. When I go and I give talks at high schools, the concepts of networks and access control and voice are going to change. So when we have this conversation 10 years from now, it's going to be really, really difficult to do that. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to hanging out with you. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.